ladies and gentlemen. I am Kenneth Nichols here with the Great Writers Steal podcast. Today, we are talking to Giano Cromley, author of the new short story collection, What We Build Upon the Ruins, from Tortoise Press. We talked about a lot of very interesting things, about how to get over when that agent dumps you, about how to build a community around yourself, how to make saying cliche things true. You're just going to have to hear it for yourself in a very spirited conversation that you will hear right after this. On tape from LibriVox, here's one of the best parts of Victor Hugo's Les Miserables.
"Silence," said the gendarme. "He is the Monseigneur the Bishop." In the meantime, Monseigneur Bienvenu had advanced as quickly as his great age permitted. "Ah, here you are!" he exclaimed, looking at Jean Valjean. "I am glad to see you. Well, but how is this? I gave you the candlesticks too, which are of silver like the rest, and for which you can certainly get 200 francs. Why did you not carry them away with your forks and spoons?" Jean Valjean opened his eyes wide and stared at the venerable bishop with an expression which no human tongue can render any account of. "Monseigneur," said the brigadier of gendarmes, "so what this man said is true, then? We came across him. He was walking like a man who is running away. We stopped him to look into the matter. He had the silver." "And he told you," interposed the bishop with a smile, "that it had been given him by a kind old fellow of a priest with whom he had passed the night? I see how the matter stands, and you have brought him back here. It is a mistake." "In that case," replied the brigadier, "we can let him go?" "Certainly," replied the bishop. The gendarme released Jean Valjean, who recoiled. "Is it true that I am to be released?" he said, in an almost inarticulate voice, and as though he were talking in his sleep. "Yes, thou art released. Dost thou not understand?" said one of the gendarmes. "My friend," resumed the bishop, "before you go, here are your candlesticks. Take them." He stepped to the chimney-piece, took the 2 silver candlesticks, and brought them to Jean Valjean. The 2 women looked on without uttering a word, without a gesture, without a look which could disconcert the bishop. Jean Valjean was trembling in every limb. He took the 2 candlesticks mechanically and with a bewildered air. "Now," said the bishop, "go in peace. By the way, when you return, my friend, it is not necessary to pass through the garden. You can always enter and depart through the street door. It is never fastened with anything but a latch, either by day or by night." Then returning to the gendarmes, "You may retire, gentlemen." The gendarmes retired. Jean Valjean was like a man on the point of fainting. The bishop drew near to him and said in a low voice, "Do not forget, never forget, that you have promised to use this money in becoming an honest man." Jean Valjean, who had no recollection of ever having promised anything, remained speechless. The bishop had emphasized the words when he uttered them. He resumed with solemnity, "Jean Valjean, my brother, you are no longer belong to evil, but to good. It is your soul that I buy from you. I withdraw it from black thoughts and the spirit of perdition, and I give it to God."
We are here with Giano Cromley, author of the brand new collection of short stories, What We Build Upon the Ruins, from Tortoise Books. Giano, welcome.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Ken. I'm glad to be here.
Well, as you know, this is a podcast all about helping other writers and figuring out how to get by in this crazy writing world. Can you tell us about your writing journey, how you've come to be here today?
Sure. I guess from as early as I can remember, I always enjoyed telling stories. That was a big part of what how I entertained myself growing up. And I feel like it was something that I always kind of pursued, to some degree more than others. as I got a little bit older, as I got into college, I majored in literature and creative writing in college. So I think that was kind of the first inclination I had that I might, be able to do something with it. I think I also probably maybe had a somewhat inflated sense of what I was able to do. By that I mean, I think I thought I must be awesome at it because it was just something I enjoyed doing. I didn't realize how much work would actually go into doing it and into getting to where I am today. And I still think I have a lot more work ahead of me if I want to keep doing it. But, after college, I kind of floated around. I was in Washington DC for a while working in politics. And then after about a little over 4 years doing that is when I went to graduate school to get my MFA. And then, after that, I moved to Chicago, and I've been teaching, some ESL and GED classes. And then ultimately I began teaching college English and college literature classes. And all the while I would be writing kind of on the side and kind of harboring these ambitions and going through that whole, kind of submission, anticipation, rejection, dejection, kind of, roller coaster. And, I mean, basically, I guess it all kind of started to gel together about 4 years ago when I had a novel get accepted by, a local in Chicago, a local indie press called Tortoise Books who was interested in publishing it. And they were kind of just getting started out at the time. And, so published that. And that was kind of, I guess, a watershed moment when that novel came out because it really kind of got me, I began to kind of become more immersed in the writing scene here in Chicago. Made a lot of really good friends who are writers and kind of found a community here of writers, which has been really kind of helpful and nurturing.
And that's The Last Good Halloween.
Yes, correct.
A novel from 2014.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, Tortoise Books published it. They seem to have an interesting publishing model, which is everything now. Like, everything has been so shaken up by the way things have changed. But tell me about the community that you found either in your MFA or what does it mean to have a community, and how can we as other writers try to build that around ourselves?
I mean, it's really hard. I think that one of the benefits of an MFA program, and this is, I have a lot of ambivalent feelings about MFA programs in general, but one definite benefit is that you kind of go in with a ready-made community, and that would be your peers in your classes, who are basically accepted on the same basis that you were accepted. So whatever the program is, whatever they're looking for, whatever style is their kind of forte, you go in, and ideally it's a program where there are people who are interested in doing the same things you are. And in that sense, it's very easy because you walk into the classroom and that's your community. I was fortunate enough to, I met a lot of really great writers in my program. I've stayed in touch with a number of them. It turned out that I would say 5 or 6 of us happened to move to the Chicago area right after we finished the program. So when I moved to Chicago initially, I had a group of writers that, we were able to workshop stories together and kind of, help each other in terms of just ideas for places to submit or, just the kind of nuts and bolts of writing. Now, then at that point, then slowly over the years, they moved away. So I think I'm the only one that's left here now from that group. But in terms of the kind of the Chicago writing community, the best way that I found to get plugged into that was just to start going to readings, which sounds like a really obvious suggestion, but it had never really occurred to me before. So, it turned out going to readings in the, local bookstores. I mean, cause a lot of the bookstores here will feature readings from, local authors. And, you get to meet one and they'll introduce you to another. And they've just been really helpful and encouraging in terms of kind of helping me with scheduling readings and kind of giving blurbs for books, or even kind of, recommending journals that some of them might edit, say, oh, send us something. Let's see what you got. And it's been a really, really welcoming community of writers that I've found here in Chicago.
Well, that's how it's supposed to be, really, when you're focusing on the work and you're trying to help each other out. So after that, after you've assimilated into the Chicago community, you became involved with Tortoise Books. Can you tell us a little bit about the model, because it's so interesting, or how your interaction with them?
Yeah, no, it's so I had kind of dabbled in the big publishing world to the point where I had a couple manuscripts that had been good enough that a pretty prominent literary agent, was interested in taking them on. And my last manuscript, The Last Good Halloween, found itself in that position where, I had an agent, she loved it, said, this is what we're going to do with it. With that book in particular, it kind of was a tricky sell, because it was, from outward appearances, it probably, the publishing industry would label it as young adult. I never wrote it as young adult. I never intended it to be that. I wrote it as, as sophisticated and kind of mature as I thought was, appropriate for, a 15-year-old kid, which is, I think for most adults, a lot more appropriate or is a lot more sophisticated than most adults would assume. The agent was insistent that it was young adult. And so she kind of started trying to sell it to young adult, editors, and came back, just wasn't right. It was a little too mature. It was a little too, risque or edgy. And I noticed that with each kind of round of rejection, her interest in kind of responding to my frantic emails became less and less, responsive, basically. And so I kind of realized, it kind of made me reassess at that moment, okay, she's not really getting back to me that frequently. And it kind of made me think for a literary agent, it's all about quantity, and it's all about numbers, and they don't get paid unless they sell a book, and if a book isn't selling, then their interest in kind of dragging out that process, just from a pure monetary standpoint, doesn't make that much sense. And so I was pretty despondent at that point. And it was actually my wife who had kind of suggested, well, why don't you look at some of these independent publishers here in Chicago? So I started to research. Most of them you didn't need to have an agent to have them take a look at what you did. And so, I started to reach out to them, and Tortoise Books was literally it was started by a guy named Jerry Brennan, who really kind of had a similar experience with his first book, a kind of a historical fiction, book called Resistance. He had a similar experience in the publishing world. And so he kind of had the idea, well, screw this. I'm going to just start my own publishing house. And so that's what he did. And I happened to kind of catch on with him. I was the first book that Tortoise Book published that wasn't written by the founder. And, since then in that, they've probably got I think maybe a dozen or 14 different titles they've published. It's all different types. It's, some poetry, essays, fiction. I think his only kind of criteria is that it's something that's interesting, and he kind of has an eye for the type of work that doesn't necessarily have a ready-made niche in the marketplace. So he doesn't mind kind of taking his time with a piece of writing if he really believes in it, and kind of trying to find where the market is for that, or reach the people who might be interested in it.
Well, tell us about how you, in that moment where you get an agent, which, I've had a similar situation where you feel great, you're on top of the world, and things are going to happen, and you kind of start to let yourself believe it.
Sure.
How do you get over that moment where you realize, just like a dating relationship, this isn't going to work out. In some ways, it's nobody's fault. I have to move on. How do you get over that moment?
I mean, it is. How do I answer this? I mean, the part of it is you just have to realize that is exactly what writing is. Unfortunately, right? We'd love to think that it is that feeling of being in your desk and, utter creation and artistry and wordsmithing. And really, unfortunately, there are two aspects of it. There's the artistic aspect, and then there's the commercial aspect of it. Art versus commerce. And if we never had to worry about the commerce part, you would be so great, right? You could just write and, that would be the only end goal of it. But I think the way you get past a moment like that is try to remind yourself that the commercial aspect isn't the only aspect, that success can be measured in a lot of different ways, and you kind of try and pull yourself back from the brink, of whatever it is you're feeling then. I feel like you have to have a thick skin to be a writer. I mean, actually, I know you have to have a thick skin to be a writer. Unfortunately, I feel like as I get older, my skin might be getting thinner.
Really?
I feel like I was able to weather some of those, those dark moments a lot easier when I was younger. And that may be just me fondly recalling a time that never quite existed. But yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, there's no two ways about it. It's just a matter of, I have a couple kind of, images that are important to me. And one is, that idea of burning your ships in the harbor, right? I think there's an old story. It's probably not true about, I think one of the, conquistadors, and obviously that's a terrible, legacy they left, but one of them, they arrived in the new country and whoever was in charge of them ordered that the ships be burned in the harbor. And the idea was to convince his men that they were never going home, that they were going to either live or die here. And I feel like with a writer, you have to burn your ships in the harbor. Either you're going to be a writer or, either you will or you won't, but there's no other choice for, what it is you want to do.
Important words about publishing from Giano Cromley. We have to talk about our very first sponsor, Prolepsis. That's right. Prolepsis, as defined by Merriam-Webster, is the representation or assumption of a future act or development as if presently existing or accomplished. As you know, we get this term from the Greeks. Even if you don't know the word prolepsis, you've experienced it. Giano, did you watch Lost?
I did. I have. A while ago.
What's the famous prolepsis from Lost?
Oh my goodness.
It's a famous one. Don't worry. It's not a trick.
It's
Kate and Jack at the airport. Jack's got the beard. What does he say to Kate?
You are testing my knowledge of Lost in a way that it's been years since I watched
it. That's okay.
So
he looks at her and he says, with tears in his eyes, "We have to go back." And we realize that the whole time in the whole season, we weren't watching the characters in the past. We were watching them in the future. So these flash forwards help us tell stories and shape how we perceive them by playing with their narratives and changing how we perceive them.
Oh, okay.
Definitely. So, and other flash forwards that you might enjoy, Breaking Bad. If you recall, we have the pieces of that doll and all of the other bits that fell out of the plane, but we didn't know it was a plane at first.
Exactly. Yes, I do remember. Now that's a little bit more in my recent, kind of memory wheelhouse. So yes, I do remember that. And I think even some of them from the last season, the Felina, where it kind of showed him with putting guns in the trunk from the car from New Hampshire, I think.
Yeah. So because it's our sponsor, tell us, in Breaking Bad, because I love it too. In that second season, when you're watching and you see all the bodies being taken away from the white home, what is the effect that you're getting before you know the resolution?
Prolepsis?
Well, no, I'm saying like, how does it make you? How does it make you feel? So you say, oh my God, I can't believe it, season 2 starting, and they start dragging bodies away from the white home. And what is it? What is the effect created in the viewer's head?
I mean, I guess dread, fear.
Okay, so it's a way to build dread and fear, and it's a way to make people think about the overarching narrative, and the way that all the other activities relate in the show. So, yeah. Prolepsis. Think about it.
Okay.
All right. Well,
I'm glad to know that they're sponsoring us today.
I'm trying to be fun. It's trying to be fun.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. So, and as you said, you worked in politics. Now, obviously, we have plenty of, certain kinds of political podcasts, but what I find interesting, politics is a microcosm of some really interesting things. So it's been said that politics is Hollywood for ugly people. So you have a whole bunch of people in one little place, all of whom are working on very important things and things that change the world in many ways. All of them are kind of friends, even if they're on other sides of the aisle. And they all have their own personal needs and desires and wants, and a lot of them are really young. It's a crazy, crazy world. So tell us how the relationship between studying and observing and participating in politics to writing.
Well, I think in terms of kind of how it's working in politics shaped my writing, especially, I worked as a speechwriter and a deputy press secretary, and really what that taught me how to be was a professional writer, in the sense that, I would come in the morning. I may or may not have kind of a plan for how the day was going to unfold. And inevitably, whatever that plan was, would go completely sideways by about 10 in the morning. So, I could find myself having to write press releases about agriculture subsidies. I could find myself having to write a speech about the importance of arts funding. And it really, when you get, when something like that comes up, you really have, maybe an hour or 2 hours at most to get it done and have it done well, have it, make sense and be able to reach people. And, it really did just kind of force me to think about how what I wrote would affect people, how they would absorb that information. And, a lot of the times, especially, it's, you're taking kind of complex things like agriculture subsidies and you're trying to write about them in a way that would be relevant for someone who's just kind of, got out of bed in the morning, is reading the paper, or, turns on the TV and, wonders why arts funding might be important, to their daily life. So it was, it was kind of a very, very helpful period for me as a writer, I would say.
Well, one of the things that strikes me about political writing is that in the vast majority of examples, it's all very rote.
Yes.
And you have to figure out some way to make it new. Like when you're opening a new museum, the candidate or the politician is going to say, the arts have always been the backbone of humanity, and how we are human today. We celebrate blah, blah, blah. Like it's all rote. How do you balance saying what you kind of have to say? Like if you're talking about some awful, horrible thing that happened to a constituent, it's all going to be the same words, but how do you make it new? Which applies to regular writing, like archive, like literary.
Yeah. No, it's an incredible challenge. And I think actually one of my challenges when I left politics and got into kind of the writing program was to actually just kind of realize that there were so many cliches in my writing that I had to strip out, because, a lot of political rhetoric absolutely relies on, kind of, political cliches, because they're kind of comforting because there's something people have heard before, right? I think there was a John Oliver, sketch where he said something about it was one of those kind of in between video segments where he said, and now politicians talking about how small business is the backbone of the economy. And it was just, and that is like one of those kind of classic political cliches. So I had to obviously kind of relearn how to strip those out of what I wrote. I think in terms of how when you're writing in politics, how do you make it seem new? A big part of that, and again, this in and of itself is a little bit of a cliche, although it does have, a basis in it does have an important value, and that is you try to find the local impact of what it is, like a policy that you're talking about. So when I would write about arts funding, so I worked for a senator from Montana, and there would be a lot of people. Montana's a relatively conservative state where they might say, well, why is arts funding important? And then, then you kind of dig in and you research and you realize, well, funding for the NEA it goes to supporting Shakespeare in the Park, right? And Shakespeare in the Park is, performing in, a lot of little towns, along northern Montana that might not see something like that otherwise. And so then you kind of reach out to maybe people in those communities and talk to them and maybe try to incorporate what their experience was. So I guess trying to find the human impact of these things is really the way you do that. And I think that was something that was really helpful to me then as I kind of moved into fiction writing. Why does this story that I want to tell, why is it important to, other people?
It's the human impact and the specificity.
Yes.
You have to somehow make this museum opening special, just like the parent, in your book you have a family building a canoe. That's common, that happens all the time. So what is special about this building of the canoe?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's what's the line, you look for the telling detail. I spend a lot of time looking for telling details, a little detail that may seem like an offhanded, kind of, observation, but actually could end up revealing quite a bit about who that character is, and so I do actually really, when I'm looking around at people, observing them, I try to kind of take note of what those details are that might reveal something about them that they're not actually revealing. It's kind of a tell.
Definitely. I want to get into talking about your collection since I mentioned it. What We Build Upon the Ruins is 11 stories, and you've been published in some places that have rejected me, justifiably, like Word Riot, Literal Latte, 3 Penny Review. And these 11 stories, they're all a little bit different, but they kind of feature a kind of a Midwestern domesticity. I guess, it's just a, easy classification.
Sure.
But there's a lot of family themes in the book. Tell us about how you came to put the book together.
There's no kind of, well, I think there are some unifying threads, but the earliest story in this collection, meaning the one that I kind of wrote the first draft of, I probably wrote in 1997. So really this is a collection that spans, almost 20 years of writing. Been working on other things. It wasn't like I took 20 years to write 11 short stories, but, short stories have kind of always been the thing that I work on in between projects. So, it wasn't like, I sat down and kind of wrote these stories from beginning to end. So, it's interesting for me when I go back and look at this collection, I can kind of point to exactly where I was at that time or what was going on in my life at that time to, as to what that story represents. So it's kind of interesting, so when people do recognize a theme in them, I'm always kind of interested because that probably means there was some overriding preoccupation I maybe have had over, the last 20 years.
I think that I've definitely felt that same thing where I look at stuff that I published a long time ago or wrote even longer ago, and it's definitely a chronicle of my own life in addition to being just, a story I wrote 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really nice, the way, how you sense memory when you pick up a smell and smell will instantly take you back. It's almost like that with some of these stories where, cause this kind of putting this collection together has kind of caused me to go back and look at some of these that I hadn't looked at in, years. And I'll kind of instantly go back and think, oh my gosh, that's where I was. That was the apartment I was living in when I wrote that, or, that was the neighbors were doing when I was kind of at that time, writing it. So, it's kind of a nice walk down memory lane, I guess.
That's one of the reasons that I tell everybody that they can and should write. I don't tell anybody they can be good at it, or especially good at it. But my goodness, you're right. Looking back, over the stuff that you write, even if no one ever sees it, is something that it's kind of like your own autobiography, even though it's all fiction.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of nature in the book as well. Tell us about your connection with nature, or why it matters to you seemingly so much.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in Montana, and I think kind of, when you grow up in a place like Montana, I mean, not to generalize, but I just feel like you have a connection to nature that's pretty hard to ever shake. So, I mean, I tell people, that I've got mountains in my blood, because I just kind of feel like there's always that pull toward nature for me. And unfortunately, there just isn't that much of it here in Chicago. So I kind of feel like I'm a little bit deprived on that front. But I've always felt probably most comfortable in nature. And I feel like it's, when I'm writing about, subjects or, stories that are taking place in the natural world, that's just kind of, for me, I guess, right in my wheelhouse. That's, I think everyone kind of has their milieu that when they write, like, that's their kind of preferred setting, whether it's a social setting or a, urban setting or whatever. For me, it's, things that are set in the natural world to a degree where even stories that aren't taking place in the natural world, I think there's a preoccupation or there's that nature is somehow kind of a part of that in many ways.
Definitely. And another of the things that I liked about the stories is that you involve kind of the working person in a lot of ways that we sometimes don't often see. For example, one of the stories that I liked was Coyote in the City.
Oh, thank you.
And it begins, I'll just read a tiny bit, but I like the way that you establish character and tone quickly by saying, Ellis Jackson knew he'd taken the easiest route life had offered. Coming out of high school, he'd gotten a football scholarship to a Division II school, but he opted instead to stay in Billings and follow his father into the roofing business. The job suited him. It was outdoors and engaged his senses. The sticky tar vapors, the rough feel of new shingles, the satisfying kick of the nail gun as it snicked another nail home. The work was a language he understood, a mantra he chanted in his native tongue.
Yeah.
And then in the course of the story, it turns out that the roofing didn't quite continue. But you have a character who's getting off parole. You have people working for the city parks department. What's the importance of depicting these kind of characters in your fiction and in fiction writ large?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's enough literature out there about college professors and about, kind of, 20-somethings trying to figure, trust me, I've written these stories about 20-something college graduates trying to, figure out their place in the world.
Well, what if it's 700 pages? What's wrong with that?
Absolutely nothing. Nothing wrong with that at all. No, so I guess I just I think I sometimes, and I don't, to me, I feel like that isn't a conscious choice on my part. I have had people mention that to me about this collection, that it seems to have a lot of kind of blue collar or working class people in it. And it hadn't even occurred to me before. In that particular story, that's a job that I actually had for a summer, where I was emptying garbage for the city parks department. And actually there was a stretch where I did get partnered up with someone who was on parole. And, it was very interesting to me, because I had to, I was probably 19 or 20 years old at the time. And we would be on lunch, and I would have to, his parole officer would call, and I would have to kind of verify that he was, working and doing his job and with me the whole day, and had never been out of my sight and stuff, which kind of was just a very strange position for me as a 19-year-old to be in. I mean, he was an older man, and I just remember kind of, when he looked at me and said, can you talk to my parole officer? There was this look of vulnerability in him, like like I held some kind of, power over him. It was a strange moment for me. I still remember that, even though it was probably 25 years ago now.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to have all kinds of experiences. When people go from high school to college to grad school.
Yes.
And, they didn't really have any jobs along the way. Like, I don't know. I don't know.
Oh, no, I agree 100%. I am so thankful that I worked for 4 years, for almost 5 years before I went to graduate school. That gave me so much more perspective on what I was doing there and just, what I wanted how to approach it. Oh, absolutely. That would have been a nightmare for me to have not taken the time between undergrad and graduate school.
Oh, definitely. And speaking of talking about the real life, we have to talk about our other sponsor, the Romano Clef. The Romano Clef. It's French for the novel with a key. And once you understand the key, you can unlock what the story is really about. The most famous example, I guess, at the moment would be The Devil Wears Prada. Lauren Weisberger's book about the fashion industry, which clearly was a thinly veiled account of Anna Wintour. Did you see the film, or did you read the book?
I neither, actually. I know many people who have seen the movie who said that it was really good.
It's fun. It's a fun movie, and it's better than the book. I like the movie.
Now, what's the key to that, though? Because I did not know that was a Romano Clef.
Lauren Weisberger is a writer. She wrote a book called The Devil Wears Prada about an evil fashion designer or a fashion magazine editor who treats her badly and makes her get her coffee and if you're not going to believe this, but she makes the poor young assistant go to her house early in the morning and bring her magazines and stuff. I don't know if you can believe it.
Tragic.
I know it's tragic. Yeah. And she works at a fashion magazine, and the editor has the gall to criticize her fashion. I can't believe
that's too much.
I can't believe it. So it turns out that Ms. Weisberger was an assistant for Anna Wintour, who does Vogue magazine. She's so that's the key.
So that's the key. Okay. I was thinking that was more like a Finnegan's Wake thing. Like you don't understand it unless you understand that,
No,
X means what.
It's very straightforward. For example, Primary Colors, you might recall the book from the 90s, Joe Klein.
Yes, I read that. Actually, oddly enough, so I have this thing, I don't want to go on an extended, but sometimes I like to read books that aren't great to help me get excited to write my own books, even in that same genre. So I wrote a political novel when I was in graduate school, and I read Primary Colors as kind of to get me psyched up to write it.
Oh, sure. And that book is it's a thinly veiled, mostly real account of Bill Clinton's campaign in 1992. So that's a Romano Clef. And these are there's a couple of reasons for them. First of all, you do it so you don't get sued.
Yes.
So Anna Wintour will say, "Hey, that's mean," but the publishers can say, "No, it's not Anna Wintour, it's Blanna Blintour,"
Plausible deniability.
Plausible deniability. Also, it's fun because you're peeling back the secrets that people want to read about.
Yeah.
I'm not a big fashion person, but I would love to see what goes on in the fashion world.
Sure.
And that's what she showed me. And there's plenty of other Romans Clef out there.
Oh, good. I'm glad you did the correct plural form of it.
I do that.
Attorneys General.
Attorneys General. Yeah. It drives me crazy when people say attorney generals.
Yeah, that's really the hardest part about being a grammar nerd. It sounds like you might be a fellow grammar nerd. So.
Yeah. On the other hand, if you say, like RBI in baseball, you sound like a jerk if you're like, oh yes, he had 7 RSBI.
I know, and yet I can't. I do say that. Yeah. I say RSBI, even though it's ridiculous.
Well,
but yeah,
think of it this way: if you're going to say just the acronym, the RBI, if you treat the acronym just on its own, it's okay to put the S after it. But if you're saying runs batted in, the S, you can put the S where it belongs. So how about that?
Yeah. Okay, all right. You've given me an excuse to not sound like a total pain in the butt
when awful pedant.
Yes, there you go. Yeah.
So that leads me into another thing that I like talking about. How do we bridge the gap between the literary world, which we love, which we both have educations in, and the broader world out there? How do we get normal people who don't have degrees in creative writing to read our writing? How do we make more readers? How do you balance that, and what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think it comes down to what you choose to write. And I think that there is, so I think, and I think you and I kind of alluded to this, or you alluded to this a little bit when we were emailing to set this up, the term literary, right? And what does the term literary mean? And I think that can be a very off-putting term to a lot of people because it has connotations, that can be, that often, when people kind of conjure the image they get when they hear a literary novel or a literary book, they often think, well, okay, there's not very much plot. There's probably a lot of kind of very flowery prose and very kind of sophisticated sentence construction and things like that, maybe just kind of people don't always want to pick up a book, or they often don't want to pick up a book to kind of feel like they're reading, a 400-word experiment, created by the author. And so, I mean, I've always, when I write, I think it's important, whether it's a short story or a novel, to have some kind of narrative force in it. For me, when I read things, I am interested if there is a narrative, there's narrative stakes, there is a story that's unfolding, there is some kind of tension that is kind of pulling me along. It doesn't have to be, will the character solve the murder or will they thwart the evil plot? It doesn't have to be, a giant stakes for your story, but something, right? So in my canoe stories, that's a series of 3 stories in my collection, each one of those, I wanted to have something happening in the process of making that canoe where we didn't know if it would work out, if it wouldn't succeed. So, the middle story, they're kind of in the process of taking away the frame of it, and they're about to find out if the canoe is going to actually hold its shape and remain a canoe, and whether they'll be able to continue building it. And so, to me, I don't think it's, any kind of violation of my literary credentials to kind of draw that moment out in a way that kind of creates anxiety, creates tension, and hopefully creates interest in the reader. I think people, they want to have that when they read. I don't think there's anything wrong with giving that to them.
One of my rules of thumb with that, I love TC Boyle. I don't know if you love TC Boyle.
Sure,
but
absolutely.
Every one of his stories are a little bit different, even though it's the same writer, and you can tell that he has the same kind of things that he thinks about. But you can say with each of his stories, that is the one about the genetically engineered dog. That right? That is the one about the Latin American pitcher whose mother gets kidnapped. You can say that story where. Like in your story, I can say, I can think back a year from now and I'll say, oh, that was that story where the guy who was the roofer had to work with the guy who was paroled. Like there's some kind of hook, as opposed to, oh, that was that story where, oh my God, it was like raining all the time, or they didn't know if the rain would stop, or I don't even know.
No, I know exactly what you're talking about. It's funny you would say that, and I'm really glad to hear that you think of that as a positive thing. I think sometimes I worry that I have such varied interests when it comes to writing. Sometimes it feels like I'm working on a project and it's so vastly different from what I had done before. Will anyone even, will anyone who read my first, book or my first, the story like this next one, because it's so vastly different. But I think, I kind of have that voracious interest where I want to read about all these different types of things. And so I tend to write that way as well. It's good to hear that is, you think of that as being a positive.
I like what you're saying, and I want to ask you about that, because what makes us follow a writer, particularly a writer who is who sells well, and book sales aren't everything, but the point is that you're reaching people. So someone like Stephen King can do extremely not low class, you know what I'm saying, something like Christine or Cujo, but then he can do The Shawshank Redemption, and all the while people will follow him. Like people who don't like fantasy might read The Dark Tower and still enjoy it. So what do you think makes us? What are the properties that make us follow a writer as they do different things?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if this applies necessarily to Stephen King or me. I mean, I don't have a following of any sort, but, I think you have to be really generous with the reader. And by that, I think what I think that means is that I feel like you should be able to open any book of mine to any page. And if you read that page, there should be some moment, some sentence, some observation where you look at it and say, oh, wow, that's nice, or that's interesting, or that's a pretty image or something, right? Like, so I don't feel like you should have to wade through 20 pages of a novel to kind of feel like you're getting some kind of reward. So I really am very conscious of that, even if it's just like what I think might be a lovely turn of phrase or an interesting way to describe the appearance of something, or a line of dialogue that someone says in a way that kind of makes you kind of almost snap your head back a little bit. So I consider that to be like a generosity that a writer should give to readers and be actually conscious of. And I think hopefully that will, take root and people will be kind of, interested in that.
Yeah, I often use the metaphor of saying that reading shouldn't be homework. In some novels, they do feel like homework.
Sure.
The author isn't thinking about why should anyone pick up this book? Oh, because it got awards, or
yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know.
No, I agree completely. I mean, and I don't know if that says something about me that isn't necessarily very flattering, but I agree completely. I think I don't believe in writing as homework. I mean, it's one of those funny things. You and I were talking a little bit about the teaching. A novel like The Great Gatsby has the extreme misfortune of being taught in high school
as homework.
Yeah, as homework, right? Like, and I remember having to read it, I think in high school and despising it. And then, I picked it up again as an adult, and I was blown away with how wonderful it was. And, it's kind of unfortunate for The Great Gatsby, although I think, Fitzgerald is probably pretty happy with, the estate's, royalties it's still getting. Yeah, I think so. But, it is kind of an interesting thing that sometimes it's just a matter of the timing with when you read something and whether or not it's homework or something enjoyable.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough situation because your high school teacher has to assign you a book.
Yeah.
There's no way around it. And on the other hand, you're right. It is when something's forced upon you, there's that natural tendency to resist, especially when you're a teenager. My goodness.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So definitely, we're trying to make new readers of all ages and all reading levels. So what is next for you?
Well, I mean, I'm kind of gonna probably go into hibernation, through the new year. And then I think after that, I've got a manuscript for a sequel to my first novel. It's about 90% done at this point. So I'm gonna be kind of working with my publisher to kind of get that in shape. And hopefully that'll be out next year sometime. Maybe. We'll see. And then after that, I literally have absolutely nothing, in the coming down the pike, which is actually, I'm very much looking forward to at this point, kind of having that completely blank slate. It feels like a while since I've had that feeling, which normally is a feeling that induces dread in me, but it's been so long that I'm actually quite excited about it. I kind of have a lifelong fascination, with Bigfoot. So I feel as if I'm being called to write a Bigfoot novel of some sort. I don't know what that.
When I was a kid, I was definitely into cryptozoology and UFOlogy. Do you believe for real, or is it just you love the mythology?
I believe that it's fun to believe. I believe that it's fun to believe in the possibility and just the mythology of it. I just love, I just love to read the stories of people that, and I certainly am highly skeptical, but But I think what's fascinating to me is what those beliefs in others say about us, right? I mean, and not to give too much away, but I mean, the working title for this Bigfoot novel is American Mythology. And the idea that like what we believe or don't believe or tell each other about Bigfoot says far more about us than what, Bigfoot itself would say about us. So, yeah, I just find that the intersection of that to be so fascinating. So, I'm kind of interested in trying to roll up my sleeves on that.
Yeah, and it definitely goes for all of the other mythologies that we believe, like the UFOs, any conspiracy, the Kennedy conspiracy.
Sure.
It definitely reveals more about us, in interesting ways.
Yeah, exactly. In very interesting ways. Absolutely. The things, it reveals the things we don't think it reveals.
So awesome. We will definitely be looking for that book, and the sequel to the novel. You can see, Giano Cromley's, Twitter at Gianos, and you can find his website at gianocromley.com. Again, yes. Giano, thank you very much.
Ken, thank you very much. This is really a fun time.
A fun time indeed. Many thanks to Giano Cromley. And remember, Shakespeare did it. So should you. Great Writer Steele.